Welcome to the Podcast Cafe, where we're serving up everything you need to know about podcasting, from tips, stories, and strategies for podcasters from podcasters. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, the founder of Espresso Podcast Production, a full-service podcast agency helping business owners, creatives, and thought leaders launch and grow their shows. Whether you're just starting out or want to take your podcast to the next level, this is the place for you. Each week, we'll dive into practical tips, actionable strategies, and of course, stories from other podcasters so that you can build up a podcast that you love and that works for your business. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get started. Welcome to the Podcast Cafe. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Cafe. I'm your host, Haley Hayhurst, and today I'm joined with one of my clients, Ronit Plank. She's the creator of the podcast Let's Talk Memoir. In this episode, Ronit shares her journey into podcasting, what inspired her to start this niche podcast, and how she's grown her show to become such a rich resource for writers, memoir enthusiasts, and creative professionals. She also has so much advice to share for new podcasters, as this is not her first show that she's ever started. And also, she has great advice for growing your show and your personal brand. As I mentioned, Ronit is a client of mine. We've been working together for about 3 years. We've worked on 3 different podcasts together, and she's just a joy to work with. So let's get right into this episode, and all of the links for Ronit and myself are in the show notes. So if you have any questions for us, feel free to reach out. All right, enjoy. Hey, Ronit, thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I am so excited to be speaking with you today.
Haley, it is so fun to see your beautiful face and to get to work with you on this, since we usually work together behind the scenes.
Yes, so we've worked together for quite a while now. I think like going on 3.5. You know what's so funny, Ronit? I was on a call with someone yesterday, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to write your podcast description. Like, where is your bio at? And he was like, oh, it's on Alignable. And I was like, what is Alignable? Like, I've never heard of this. And that's where we met. So I had to log in.
Yes, that's right.
And it's so funny because it was literally yesterday. And I was like, oh, our messages are still here. It was like 2020.
Oh, really? Well, back when Alignable started popping up, I was like, what is this thing? Is it trying to be like the other things? Should I join it? And then I never answered anything. I was like, is this person really sending me a message, or is this Alignable sending me a message that I should send this person a message? And then I saw yours. I was like, is this like a fake person? But for whatever reason, I sort of poked around and looked at it and read it. And then I wrote back to you because I was at that point where I was looking for some more help. And that's how we met. And I also always remember that because you reached out to me cold. Absolutely cold. You took a chance. And then I decided, let me give this person a chance. And then we just worked together more and more and more and built more and more. I gave you more and more jobs. And now the rest is history. So that was a complete cold approach on your part.
Yeah, it was. It was right when I was starting my business. You were like my second client I ever worked with. So
it's unbelievable, right? That it worked out. Well, thank you, because I really don't think I would have. Look, we're just launching into our conversation about podcasting. But I never, ever... I don't think I would have done the other 2 shows I did if I didn't have your help. It just would have been too much.
Yeah, well, that means a lot to me. So I'm excited to talk to you about all the podcasts that you've worked on. But I have a big question for you, since we are in the Podcast Cafe and we're both in Seattle. What is your go-to coffee order?
Oh, I love this. It's so simple. It's very, maybe disappointingly simple. I'll just get an Americano with like an inch of room. That's all I get. I get like a 12 ounce, like a tall Americano with an inch of room. And then I put a little cream in it, or like fake cream in it, or I drink it black. But if I'm with a friend and it's, later in the day and I want like a treat, I'll get a soy latte.
Yum. Yeah. Classic.
And I like the soy because I know people are like, oh, soy. They like oat milk these days. Your generation, they prefer the other milks. But I get the soy because at least there's a little protein in it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm getting so many different coffee orders on this podcast so far. Well, before we get started talking about your podcast, I want to focus on Let's Talk Memoir for this conversation, and then we'll talk about, the other podcasts that you've had in the past. But since Let's Talk Memoir is your current podcast, how about you describe it for us in 3 words to kick us off?
Okay. Let's Talk Memoir is a nurturing, insightful, and warm podcast.
That's a great way to describe it. See, you're a writer. I knew you could come up with this. No, I think that's definitely a great way to describe Let's Talk Memoir. So how about you tell us more about your show and a little bit more about your history of podcasting?
Sure. Okay, and I can talk a lot, so you can always, wave me down if I've gone too long and I'm like off the runway and in the air and you need to bring me back home. The first time I ever podcasted was back in 2017, and I was with a friend doing a co-hosting thing and somebody else was producing it. We just came in with like our material and we bantered and talked about politics, and we were talking about the Me Too movement, and that was really fun. But I ended doing that about a year after starting, and some time went by and I realized, I think I can do a podcast. And so I launched a podcast called And Then Everything Changed. And I really was scrambling. And later on, when we talk about advice and stuff, I will reference this podcast again. But that's where I met you about a year into my trajectory of doing that one. And I interviewed people about the pivotal moments in their life and things that define them. And then I stopped after about 2 years. It was becoming, maybe it was 2 or 2.5 years. I felt like I had to churn out all this material and I didn't really know where it was going. And so I took a break and I said it would come back. And some time went by. I guess I have a pattern. And I realized my memoir had come out. My memoir, When She Comes Back, had been released. And I was learning more and more about the craft of memoir writing. I'd already gotten my master's in writing, but I was interviewing more writers. And I really loved those episodes of And Then Everything Changed when I got to read a book and interview memoirists. And so I was like, I went to a podcast conference where they talked about niche podcasts. I went to the She Podcast Live podcast conference, and they were talking about this one session about why niche podcasts are so good. And it just hit me, or maybe it had already been kind of, forming in my head. But that was the moment I realized I want to do a podcast about memoir, just about memoir writing. And I did a search, crossing my fingers there weren't too many because I was scared. I wanted to have this original idea. And I didn't see too many. And I was like, okay. And my daughter, who's now in college, helped me name it. Originally, it was going to be About Your Memoir, which I think was a little snarky. Actually, it was sort of like it was going to be called About Your Memoir, which is actually not bad, I guess. But she said, why don't you just call it Let's Talk Memoir? And then boom, I went with it. And I created the art, I had you weigh in on the art. And now I interview memoirists about the writing life, their writing process, craft tips, how long it took to publishing. And I always begin the podcast in one way and I always end it in one way. But in between, there's kind of like an assortment of different things I ask.
Yeah.
And I guess I should add, I have like 100, at the time of this recording, we have 131 episodes, which is almost inconceivable to me, and we're continuing on.
I love your podcast because people can learn so much from it. So that's something that you definitely put into each episode, making sure that your audience walks away learning something. And also, you read every memoir before you interview them. So your interview process is very extensive, but in-depth as well, which is, I think, great.
Yeah, it is a bit of it's a little bit of an undertaking. And I have to say that the first season was just 15 episodes. This is another point that I should probably make, is that when we first launched it, I said, let's just try it. It's a limited series. I didn't have a lot of expectations. I just said, let me just do 15 episodes and see what happens. Yeah. So I called it a limited series because I think I wanted to make sure I liked it. I wanted to make sure there was enough of a response, or at least something affirming inside of me that wanted to continue doing it. Because part of And Then Everything Changed, what kind of weighed me down was I ended up feeling like I was shackled to the schedule and that I had to show up all the time and do it. And I was growing a little tired. And also the other thing is I got a lot of requests to be guests on my show. I mean, once you start putting a show out, a podcast out, you will be really surprised and happy because people will start coming to you, and you don't even have to work that very hard at promotion. They just start to find it, and word gets around if you're a decent host. And I had so many requests to be on my show. I did not know how to juggle it. And then I sort of felt like I had to host them, or I had to air every single interview, even if it wasn't a really amazing interview in my mind. So I wanted to be careful. And after I did the first season of Let's Talk Memoir, I realized, I'm going to come back for another season. And you and I talked because after the second season, I took a break, and I think you and I discussed it, and you said very gently, and it wasn't like you were being bossy at all. I just said, what do you think of my breaks, taking breaks? Because I need a break, to kind of restore and set myself up again. you said, well, the only downside about that is that you might be losing some retention. You know, you might lose retention because you're taking a couple months off or the summer off. And I thought about that and I was like, okay. And I hate that idea. So I just started rolling every season into the next, you know. I take no breaks now, which is, you know, pros and cons, but I can set up my schedule so that I'm not pounding out a lot of interviews in 1 month. I'll have some time where it's a lot slower, but it's more on a continuum now.
Yeah. And you do batch record your episodes. So can you tell us maybe a little bit about that process?
Yes. So in an ideal world, this is my ideal vision. And I know some podcasters who do this, and I just need to get more organized or a little more strict with myself. In an ideal world, I'd say I'm only going to record, you know, in October and November, let's say. And then I'm only going to record even Tuesdays and Thursdays, let's say. I'm only going to do 2 or 3 a day. Those are my recording days. This would be the dream. And then all of December and January, for example, I'm not recording and I'm just maybe editing with you. So there's like a workflow. What happened was, because I'm no longer taking those breaks, I have to build in the breaks myself. So I will say now, even if the podcast is airing every week, which is what it does, and sometimes twice a week, it airs on Tuesdays. And you know that sometimes we air on Thursdays as well. If I feel like people have been waiting too long or they have a book coming out and I just don't want to get too behind. So then I'll be like, okay, I'm not recording in June and I'm not recording in July. I'm just not going to do it because it's the summer. And if people pitch me, I'll say, I will get back to you in August or September. And then I'll pick up my submissions again and take a look. But I think I could still be a little bit more regimented about it because I do allow a creep, which isn't ideal for me. Like, for example, today I had a recording before we're doing this. And yesterday I had 2 interviews. But that was it for the week, which is lovely. A good week sometimes is to not have any recordings because then I'm reading the books. Like my next recording is next week. So I'll usually have a weekend to sort of read 2 books or pour over some books to get ready. But I do think that if we're going to continue to do this podcast for 10 years, you know, I really would need to get even stricter with my boundaries. And boundaries is really important as a podcast host and in life.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you mentioned She Podcasts at convention for podcasters. I know that you have spoken at that, like hosted panels. Can you tell us more about those panels? And I mean, that's a good way to market your podcast as well.
Oh, it's so good. So, okay, there are a lot of conferences out there and you might even know more of them. And maybe we could even put some in the show notes because I went to She Podcast Live in person. I attended once virtually. And then I went to PodFest in Florida a year and a half ago, I believe. And that was giant. So She Podcasts in person was all women and women identifying podcasters, which I liked because it kind of shrinks the amount of people who can really be there. And I did a panel the first time I attended where I was one of the speakers on it. And the second time I talked about interview techniques and it was just me. And it was really nice because podcasters who follow you or who didn't know about your show, both of them will come up to you and talk to you. They give you their cards. I met when I went to PodFest, which was giant, as I mentioned, and everybody goes. So many people at these sort of business meetings, you just swap cards, and then they reached out to me afterward to see if I wanted to be on their show or if they could be on my show. So if you're looking for guests or you're looking to be a guest, I would highly, highly recommend going to these conferences. It's one of the quickest ways, if you can afford it, if you have the time. It also is really powerful to see how many people are podcasting and how many resources you have, whether it's figuring out a new platform to record, finding out what the best mics are, learning who else is in your niche. It's really a great way to integrate and feel less alone because so much of what we do is solitary, depending on your podcasts, could be because some of the people who do podcasts are doing their own host-led podcasts without interviews. But I always wanted to do interviews. I would not want to host for hours on end, just myself talking. Though I sound really comfortable and I'm okay at it, I really much prefer to get into the head of somebody else and have them share. But I hope I answered your question. I do think that, and I do love doing panels because I also show up to panels for writing. I love the teaching aspect of panels and conferences. I am a teacher, a memoir teacher, and I've taught other things. So for me, sharing what I know with other people, helping other people is part of what I do.
Yeah, definitely. And to that point, since you are a memoir teacher and are so in this world of writing, your podcast is almost like a portfolio of what you work on, right? It's kind of like an example of your work because it promotes
Yeah.
obviously your memoir when she comes back, but it also you write for different various news outlets and online blogs and magazines and all these things. So having a well-researched podcast and a podcast that is a good first impression for anyone coming to your brand is so important. So
Yes, and I think it's funny because I think that I kind of engineered it backwards. Like it looks like, I don't know if we've ever talked about this before, but a friend of mine told me a year ago, you were really smart about this podcast. And I said, I wasn't so mastermindy that I thought, aha, I will have this podcast and then this will happen and this will happen and this will happen. I wasn't that crafty about it, but it happened to work out that a lot of things have flowed from the podcast
yeah,
because of it. And it's become my brand even more.
absolutely, absolutely. Do you want to share some of the things that have come from the podcast?
Yeah, for sure. So here are some things. And though I'm going to be talking about podcasting in reference to Let's Talk Memoir, what I want everyone who's listening to know is that whatever your podcast is about, whatever you do, you can build the same sort of structure into your outcomes, right? So a long time ago, I learned, I had all my social media was under the name of the podcast that I used to have. So I learned a long time ago, actually through a contact of yours who was working on my website for a while, that it should really be under my name. So now everything is under my name, which is Ronit Plank. So aside from the podcast, because my podcast isn't called Ronit Plank, featuring Ronit Plank, it's not that, but I'm not that big yet. But it's everything on my socials is Ronit Plank, so you can find me that way. And my website is Ronit Plank. It's not Let's Talk Memoir. It's Ronit Plank, and there you can find Let's Talk Memoir. But I do a lot of things that have to do with memoir. I teach workshops and classes, so I do that independently. I do that so let's say someone wants to hire me to come in and teach them, I do that. So I do one-on-ones, I do coaching, I edit manuscripts for memoirists. I also have been brought in by established writing centers who want someone to come in and talk a little bit about a memoir writing aspect. So I'll come in. I've been a memoir mentor and I get paid for all of this, which is really nice. And now I'm going to be launching a class with the university here in Washington, and that is officially going to launch in March of 2025, but it's not official yet. But anyhow, I'm going to be teaching a 10-week virtual evening memoir course that is going to go through all of the memoir writing aspects that I like to cover. And it's just 10 weeks as a smattering. And that may have grown off of my memoir expertise in this area. I also will say that because of the podcast, I've been contacted by lots of writers, lots of agents and publishers who want me to feature them on the podcast or their clients on the podcast. So this would transfer for people who are not doing a memoir podcast into brands that want to be featured on your podcast, advertisers who want to be featured on your podcast, people who are experts in the area that you're covering who would like you to feature their work or their brand. So they come to you. They really come to you. And the other thing that's happened is that I'm also looked to as someone who knows people who are in this area. So even if I'm not as famous as some of the people who I am interviewing, people ask me, hey, can you connect me with so-and-so? Because I know that they have a podcast that I want to be on as well as I want to be on yours. So it's just like, it's really endless. I mean, I hope that was articulate enough because there's just so many branches that come off of this tree when you create the thing that you love doing and you want to do more of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the benefits of having a niche topic podcast, right? Because it's clear of who listens and it's clear of who's going to be on the show. And then the connections you're making are aligned to this bigger vision that you have.
For example, I have a woman who came onto my show who wrote a book called Deep Memoir, and her name is Jennifer Seelig, and she teaches memoir quite often, and she's done this for many years. She now tells her students that Let's Talk Memoir podcast is required listening.
Wow, yeah.
So, and of course, I don't make money off the podcast, right? So it's just about the idea of the information being in the world. And also what you said earlier, that I have hundreds of hours, right? Like I have these recorded episodes of conversations with people offering their expertise, which becomes a resource that others can then use and turn into something else. So I have students at all levels listening to the podcast. I have writers and teachers listening to the podcast. And then, I probably have publishing houses and possibly editors listening to the podcast as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of endless who can be listening. But again, since it is niche, there is kind of a structure around who you're speaking to. And it also makes it easier for you to speak to the listeners' problems that they might be having or experiences that they might be having. So I'm always a fan of a niche podcast. I try to get every podcaster to niche down. I think
do you?
I do, because I think if you're too wide in what you're talking about and covering, you're not going to be able to speak to the audience as well as you can if you are niche. You know what I mean?
Yes, I also think this goes for, there's some buzzwords. I don't want to call any of them out necessarily, but there are buzzwords in our culture that have been buzzwords for a while. And so sometimes people use those in their work and their podcasts and stuff. And memoir is not unpopular. It's super popular. And there are some other podcasts that have memoir in the title. But I think that getting into a niche is such a good idea. Like, for example, Podcast Cafe, you're basically talking about podcasting as a way to create what you need to create. So it's a podcast about podcasting. No. And my podcast is a podcast about writing memoir and putting stories into the world. But that also allows me to talk to therapists. I've had therapists on about grief. It's allowed me to talk to people who kind of can incorporate resilience into their writing or into their life practice so that they can be more comfortable and more emotionally secure while they're writing podcasts. It allows me to branch out. And in fact, I even had an audiobook recorder on my podcast, someone because I wanted to speak to that element of, and then also I have someone coming on who's going to be talking about marketing your book. So while I try to stay on the nuts and bolts of writing the memoir and try to stay very focused and grounded so writers don't have to get worried about how am I going to publish? How am I going to get readers? I try not to do that too much because I want to not put the cart before the horse. I want people to feel nurtured in the writing process. But then sometimes I bring in these other guests who can speak to the marketing aspects.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that just is still aligned, but grows your network. Definitely.
Yeah.
I want to talk about how you market and promote the show because you have a very engaged audience on Instagram and on Substack you have. So you have engaged audiences. So how do you promote the podcast to them and then obviously to new people?
Well, I would say that the biggest reason why I'm able to promote as well as I can is because actually, Haley, you make my graphics and they're beautiful. Everyone loves the graphics. Every time I send my guest their folder of graphics on the drive, I say, here are your graphics. We'll be using them all week. They say, these are beautiful and they're proud of them and happy. So they want to use them, And so I always post at least 2 times with each episode that comes out. I post on Instagram. I post on Facebook. I share it on Threads. I share it on Twitter. Not as much. I share it on LinkedIn. I share it on Substack. And so I really try to cover a large group of people. And one thing I will share, which I constantly have to learn over and over again, is when I was learning about book marketing as a writer and how to get our words in front of people, the people I learned with were saying you have to post 7 times for people to see it sometimes. Like that, I don't know what the actual number is these days or if that is something you've heard before.
Definitely.
But it takes about 7 times for someone scrolling through their social media to see your post. So you might personally feel that you are bombarding your readers or listeners with material and they're going to roll their eyes and be sick of your stuff. But they miss stuff a lot because when I recently posted something about my Substack, I had several people write to me and say, I didn't know you were on Substack. And I thought, yes, I've been on Substack for 3 or 4 months, I think. And Substack it's sort of an outlet for writers and other people to post. And it's a little friendlier and more literary than Twitter. And lots of people are there now. And actually, I think I've been posting longer than that. It's not 3 or 4 months. It's almost a year now. But even people who I know in my memoir writing community did not know that I was posting there or that I had a newsletter. So the thing about posting is that you're sharing your your material and your product with the people who get to see it. But they then, if they like what you're putting out, will share it with their audiences. So after people realized I was on Substack, they restacked or reshared my post, and then I gained new followers on Substack. And the reason why that's important is because if Instagram goes down, if Facebook goes down, you want to be able to access your readers, listeners, or clients, right? And so Substack allows you to kind of print out or have and save your list of contacts and their emails. Because it did happen where I was blocked from my Instagram page a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know what I did. And I was sort of like frustrated about that because everything goes poof, you know? So I would say, don't be afraid of posting. Post what matters to you. And I would also say what I've noticed and what I learned too is when you post too much on the nose all the time about your product, you know, your podcast, it gets a little bit dulling. You want to sometimes show them what you're up to, talk to the camera, be a little more personal. And I realized recently it had been weeks since I posted my face saying anything. It had become more of like a machine. It looked like it could be AI running my account, you know? So I had to kind of step in there and say, hey, it's me. I'm alive. You know, just went to do this thing. Here are my dogs, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I love when you post your dogs, by the way. They're so cute. They're so tiny.
I'm glad. They're so cute. I love them.
Oh, yeah. That's really great advice for promoting the podcast on various different platforms. And then obviously your podcast is always around. So when someone goes to search up your name on any platform, they're going to find your website. They're going to find the podcast. And then that's also marketing for the show as well. So I'm loving what you're doing, and the numbers are showing. Like, you're always growing your show, which is
I'm so glad to hear that.
Amazing. So what you're doing works, and for the listeners, like, definitely take Ronit's advice because she's growing her show quickly.
Yeah, I just don't ever really, you know, yes, when the show drops on Tuesdays, the first thing I do, I should be writing or I should be doing other things like exercising. But the first thing I do is I post and I share because I need to do that. And I tend to think that a lot of my listeners are people who are already embedded and love it. But people are sharing it, you know, or there will be people who say, and the other thing about your guests, which of course we need to talk about, if you have a podcast with a guest, then that guest is going to also share. But I would say that you don't always know which guest is going to share a lot, nor do you know which guest is going to have their followers really pick it up. So you kind of just have to keep showing up yourself. And if someone who has a large following does share and people come and listen, that's gravy. But you just have to keep doing all the work. And if you don't like posting, if you don't like that aspect of it, and you would rather somebody else do it, I'm sure you can find someone for an affordable amount of money to do your social media.
Oh, totally. Like a social media manager can totally help there. But yeah, posting is so important. I love that you just said, like, yes, your guest promoting is so helpful, but you can't expect that, right?
No, you can't. I've had some really big guests, Haley, for me, that really didn't do much. You know, that I was like, oh, you know, and then there are other people who you thought, okay, well, they're not a giant, you know, writer necessarily, but they have an engaged group of people who adore them and are so excited that they are in conversation on this podcast that they share it all over the place. Or you have someone like Jennifer Seelig, who is now telling all of her students to listen to my podcast. And the thing about it is she's a memoir teacher, right? But she's still sharing my stuff. So there's enough for all of us.
There definitely is. Oh, that's really great advice. Before we get into the rapid fire questions I have for you, I'd love to hear if you have any other tips for anyone who wants to get into podcasting.
Yes. And in fact, I made little notes for myself so I would be really succinct because I thought about this. So here's a couple of pieces of advice. I wanted to tell you that, so I've told this story before in other ways, but I want your people to hear it, which is that if they don't already know, they should bank a few episodes before they launch their podcasts. I know everyone knows that now, but I did not know that. And my husband even told me at the time, why are you drinking out of a fire hose? I'd be like, oh no, so-and-so doesn't, this is with my old podcast, so-and-so changed her mind. She doesn't want me to, you know, air the podcast because it's about her mom and she feels really weird. So she dropped and then somebody else dropped. And I was like, oh my gosh, I only have 2 episodes left for the next month. What am I going to do? So now before I launch anything, I always have many episodes in the bank. And also, for example, like I'm looking at how many episodes I have edited now and recorded and how many interviews I have, and I can balance out and say, okay, I'm currently working 4 months ahead. But if I knew I only had a month ahead, I'd get very nervous and be like, I better get some more guests right away. Luckily, right now, that has not been a problem for me. If anything, I have to turn people away. And that happens too when you keep on putting out your product well. So the other thing you want to do, and this is what I learned with my first podcast, which I mentioned, is allow your podcasting schedule to suit your needs. Don't feel like you have to do stuff because of the podcast. If it starts to feel like that, that's going to be sort of a recipe for feeling disenchanted with your podcast. So if you want to do it every 2 weeks or, every week or twice a week, that's up to you. You get to decide. You don't, no one's going to die because you didn't drop your show when you were going to drop your show. Just be organized about it, right? The other advice I have is ask yourself what your goals are and work backward from there. So I like to do with a lot of my work, whatever it is I'm doing, what are my long-term goals, my medium goals, and my short-term goals? If I know that I want to have X amount of episodes by a certain date, then I know what I have to do to make that happen. If I know that I want to get A, B, and C writer on my show, then I need to figure out and start networking now, right? So just figure out what your goals are and you don't have to act surprised and like you don't know what you're doing. Just figure out what you want to do, make the goals that make sense for you, and stay in your lane and don't compare yourself to other people. And then the other thing I want to say is find someone like Haley. Haley didn't know I was going to say that, but you have to find someone like Haley to help you, because I could have edited all my shows if I wanted to. I mean, I'm a very slow editor. I know what I want my podcast to sound like. And I always send Haley notes like, oh, I stumble here. Can you take me out? Or, oh, I sound really dumb in this question. Can you take me out? And she'll do it for me in a second. But even adding music in the intro and the outro, I hate that stuff, and I'm not even that good at it. So I'm like, Haley, can you do this? It's the best money I've ever spent. Plus graphics. Like, I could do it, but I'm slow, and Haley does it for me. So I can focus on reading the memoir, coming up with killer questions, interviewing my guest and being fully present, and doing the other stuff in post that I need to do. So figure out what your strengths are, what is worth your time and money, because I'll tell you, you could say, oh, I don't want to pay someone to do something, but you know what? If it's going to take you 2 hours to do something that you could be doing something else with, then you should pay somebody to do that.
Oh, Ronit, thanks for sharing that. That was so nice of you.
It's true.
Those are really great tips. I think that, we could have a whole episode on just how you prepare for your guests, and then kind of like, because
I'll come back anytime.
We're going to have to do it. So those are really great tips for anyone who wants to break into podcasting or even elevate the podcast that they have now. Definitely systems and processes are key to growth. And I know that if, let's just say you wanted to edit your own podcast and do everything, it would take away from creating the questions. It would take away from...
It would.
Promoting. If you had to spend all these hours editing and then you still had to promote on top of it.
And then guess what's going to happen? You know what's going to happen? I will build up so much resentment. I'll be an angry host. I'll be not a good conversationalist, and I'll resent everyone. And I will. I'll keep doing it, but I'll resent it, or I'll quit. Right. So it's not really, to me, it's not worth it. It's like, what is your time? What do you want to do with your time?
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
totally.
How do you want to use your energy?
Yeah.
Because I'm also a mom. I'm also a wife. I have 5 dogs as well. And like, I like to write. I have another book on, like I'm always doing stuff. So I need to be sure that I don't tap out all of my energy that leaves me with nothing for the people that need my energy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Such good advice. Thanks so much for sharing those.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm ready to get into our rapid fire section. I'm excited for this.
Sure.
And Ronit, just so you know, I'm a chatty person. So sometimes this is like a slow fire, but we're going to try to get through this.
Well, it's going to be very slow because I'm a chatty person, but okay, I'll do my best.
I love it. Awesome. So first question, I have 8 questions for you. The first one is, what is the first podcast you ever listened to?
Okay, it must be This American Life way back in the day. Like, because once it turned from, it was always on NPR, but then it became available as a podcast. So then I started listening to it that way.
I love that. Mm-hmm. Besides your own genre of podcasting, what is your favorite podcast genre?
Oh my gosh, I love this question. I actually want to know yours too, but I will tell you, I don't know if this surprises you at all. I kind of get into true crime.
Do you have a favorite true crime podcast?
Well, I do kind of toggle. It's really funny, and I don't know what their political views are, so I hope that I don't get into trouble here. But first let me say I like true crime where I know the killer or the bad person's going to get caught or has been caught. I don't love as much when we don't know who did it and we're really scared. That I don't love so much. So I listen to a variety. I listen to Pretty Lies and Alibis. I listen to Nancy Grace, God help me. I listen to Zone 7 with Cheryl McCullough. I listen to Hidden True Crime. And sometimes I listen to there's another one, but I think that's good. Sometimes I'll listen to like a limited series about like the Black Dahlia or like cults and things like that, where it's like or the Girlfriends, which was like a limited series as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Those are good. I think my favorite, I really like podcasts in the wellness space, like learning those type of things. Honestly, this is like going to get me canceled from my own podcast, but I don't listen to a ton other than my clients just because this is what I do all day.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I was going to say. Like, there are a lot of other writing podcasts, and I have maybe heard them here and there, but I was I did not research a ton of writing podcasts. Before I launched this one, I didn't listen to a whole bunch and say, I like what they do here. I don't like what they do here. I'm a little like this one, and I'm a little like, no. And I should probably listen to more writing podcasts, but frankly, and this might be like where you are, I do interviewing for Memoir all the time. Yeah. The last thing I need to do is listen to more stuff about writing. Yeah. Because it's all I'm doing. If I actually tabulated how many hours I spend reading, writing, thinking about the questions I need to ask writers, editing and teaching, my life is so much memoir that I need the break. And I like some of the health podcasts as well, too. So I just need a break.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Oh, I also listen to Dumois.
Okay.
I don't know if you listen to that, the gossip one about celebrities.
No. Okay, I'm going to have to check that. I love gossip podcasts.
You have to listen to Do You then.
Have you heard of Normal Gossip?
I have heard of it.
That's like one of my favorite podcasts. It's just like so funny. So I like podcasts that I can just go on runs with and just like, you know, but so
a break. You need a break.
Gossip podcasts or wellness podcasts are my jam for sure. Okay, my next question is, do you have any dream podcast guests?
Oh my gosh. Okay, I did write this down, but this is really funny. Like, I don't have a really good one, I have to say, which is dumb. I'm sure I'll figure it out when we're done. But I did write down Paul Rudd.
Okay, amazing.
Which is funny because my husband, and this I hope he'll never listen to this, but he makes fun of me. I never even said I like Paul Rudd that much at all, even though every woman my age seems to. I never said it, but every time there's like any commercial with him or any kind of preview for anything, he's like, oh, it's Paul Rudd. It's so like, now it's like a joke in our family. And so even if I don't say anything, he'll say something about Paul Rudd. So I had to say Paul Rudd. And I'm an old school person who grew up on like old actors, old movies, old singers in musical theater. So I have to say, this is so out of nowhere. I would love to interview Shirley MacLaine, who I loved in the movie Terms of Endearment, who did like the movie Sweet Charity years ago. She's very old. She's Warren Beatty's sister. But that, like, I'm really into like the old Hollywood stuff. So that's another one.
Amazing. Yeah. I love that. Okay, you have to get Paul Rudd on there. Just
oh my God, will you help me?
I'll definitely try. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. Okay, what's one podcast you'd recommend everyone listen to?
Okay, I would recommend, this is a heavy one, but I would recommend Making Sense with Sam Harris. So he's super smart. It's called Making Sense. And I would say if anyone has ever listened to Ezra Klein or The Daily, it's a little like that. It's a little more long form. He talks really in very smart ways and has good guests about the political, social, economic, and like everything that's going on in our country and the world. And I learned a lot there after October 7th and learned about what was going on in Europe and in the Muslim communities. So along with the Jewish communities. So I just like to listen to that. It's a heavy, like I said, but if I really feel lost or that I don't know what to think, I listen to that.
I'm going to have to check them out. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What is your favorite podcast listening platform?
I always listen to Apple. It just happened. I know a lot of people listen on Spotify, and I think Spotify is hipper, but Apple just seems to be the one I've been using for a long time. And it used to be called iTunes, right?
It did, yeah.
But now it's called Apple, I listen there.
Very cool. I mean, it's a great one.
What about you? Are you Spotify?
I'm a Spotify person, yeah.
You're younger. That's why. I really think the youth listen to Spotify more than the olds.
Spotify,
I really do.
I like it because they now have video podcasts. So, like, you can upload your video
Oh,
podcast on there and kind of watch it. So, like, big podcasts will play their videos. And so,
like Call Her
yeah,
Daddy
like
and
Call Her
stuff.
Daddy has a video format. So, it's kind of cool just to, like, set your phone up. But you can obviously just listen to
Ah.
the audio platform. It's just, I think Apple Podcast is always adapting and Spotify is always adapting, so they're always going to like be having new and
Yeah.
new things, but yeah, they're both great. Okay, what is your biggest pet peeve as a podcast listener?
Oh, I have two. My first one, you might know this. I bet you could guess this. Actually, I wonder, could you guess what mine is? Do you want to guess?
Is it
And then I'll guess yours.
is it you knows?
No. That's 'cause- no, it's audio,
Okay,
bad
yeah,
audio.
yeah.
I hate that. So, and I'm not even talking about, oh, they don't have a blah, blah, blah mic. I don't care about that. I don't like, I hate echo.
Yeah.
And ironically, because sometimes
I should have
send you
guessed
tapes and
echo.
you're like, there's
I
an
should have
echo.
guessed echo.
Well, but I don't know why it happens because I have my system
Yeah.
down. I always ask my guests, but I don't like it when there's like a tinny sound. Like I'm recording in a room where there's carpeting and curtains, and I'm actually sitting in a fuzzy chair because I do not like the sound of like an aluminum can or like an empty bottle. I hate the sound of tinny, metally, cold, sharp sounds when I'm listening to a podcast. I hate it. So I much prefer it when people get their audio dialed in, and I don't understand when it's not dialed in. And sometimes you can't help it. I know that. And the other thing I don't really like it is when hosts who have an interview podcast interrupt their guests all the time, even unless it's like it's a funny bantering show, then that's good, that's fine. But I had to learn how to stop interrupting people as a person, and that has translated into my podcast.
That's a good one too. That is also one of my pet peeves for sure. And I always think sometimes if your guest is going on and on, it's better to cut it in post-production than like really be like, wait,
What about you? Is that your big pet peeve?
I would say audio is probably mine too.
Yeah.
Just like sounding underwater or just sounding far, sounding like you're in a big room. I think that there's so many, even if you're not a podcast producer like I am, there's so many ways to fix it pretty easily. I will also say not edited episodes kill me like no other. I can always tell.
Wait, do you mean when you listen, if like, so what is it that you can tell? Is it like mistakes or that is just too long?
I think mistakes. Like I like a clean, polished version of a podcast. There's podcasts out there. Some people just don't edit because they like that raw feeling, but like that's not for me. That's not like that unedited feeling. Is not
I
for me.
also have found sometimes on these podcasts that I mentioned, now and then they'll say something, and then a second later they'll say the same thing, and I'm like, did I just mess that up? And then I go back just to listen to it. They didn't edit it right. Their editor or they uploaded it without realizing that they should have played it back and realized they'd already said that. And I think, how could you do that? Like I listen to you listen to my episodes and edit them, then I listen to them to do my show notes and to grab quotes, and then I send you notes, and I'm like, okay, look, I also realized I asked this question in a clumsy way. Can you cut part of my question? I'm control-y that way, but I think you are too.
Yeah, I am. I love that. I mean, I think just for the listener experience, it's better than having a unedited podcast. And I don't know. I think that I can go off on this, Ronit. I really can go down this path for a long time. So I have a lot of feelings when it comes to this. I'll have to do a whole episode about my podcast pet peeves. Oh my gosh.
Yes, I'd love it.
Okay, I have 2 more questions for you. So what's the best advice you've ever received about podcasting?
Okay, here's one that is hard for me to pay attention to and to really commit to my heart. It's not like it preoccupies me a lot, but I do think about it sometimes, and I wish it didn't matter. But I did hear at She Podcasts at a conference that we talked about, and also on their platform, not to necessarily chase download numbers, because very few of us are going to get to the Call Her Daddy or the Seth Rogen or whoever you want to talk about. Like that is just the holy grail / unicorn. It does not happen for many of us. So because so many of us are not going to become viral podcasters or even make a living off of podcasting, it's not a good way to measure, how you're doing, which feeds into kind of what I was saying earlier about what are your goals, figure out what your goals are, that you're fully present when you're interviewing, that you enjoy the guests that you're getting, that maybe you do get that guest that you're really hoping for, or that you do get sponsored. Those are the things that you can really check. Now, look, do I check my downloads? Yes. Have any of them changed my life? No. And even on a Tuesday when I look in the evening and I think, wow, that was a lot that day. What was going on? Nothing changes. Paul Rudd is not calling me to be on my show, but maybe he will.
Maybe.
And also, I just have to say, I don't even like him that much. I mean, I like him. He's got really good skin for his age, but I'm just mentioning him because it's a joke between my husband and I.
I think that's so funny.
So, yeah.
I love that. I really love that. Okay, one more question for you. What is the most surprising thing you've learned about yourself through podcasting?
Okay, I would say I've learned two things that come to the top of my head, which is one, I actually can do things that I didn't think I could do. So I was scared about podcasting because I thought it was technical and I wouldn't understand the mics and I wouldn't understand how to use GarageBand and I wouldn't know how to edit. But I did. Before I met you, I did all that stuff and I learned because I was stubborn and tenacious and I wanted to do a podcast and I didn't want to rely on anyone. This is before I realized I did want to rely on someone like you. But I didn't want to be beholden to some production company and I just wanted control over everything. So I was proud of myself because I don't consider myself a very technical person. But the fact that I learned that actually gave me confidence. And so when my kids are having trouble with maybe their computer stuff, which I'm not a Mac person, I don't know how to do it. But if they're like, I don't get this, like, why is this link not working? Or how do I do this thing? I have more confidence that I can do it because I learned how to podcast. And then the other thing I want to say is that we can change. And what I learned is that I can toggle and change and grow. Because a long time ago, I did not see myself as someone who would be patient and let people talk. I was a talker only. I was an actor, a performer. I needed to be the center of attention. And obviously, I'm not kidding anyone. I am the host of this podcast. It's my baby. I'm at the helm, right? But I have been able to make space for other people and to welcome their stories and to give them the mic. And that is not anything that I thought I would have been able to do if you had asked me 10 years ago. So yeah, being able to change and being able to learn new things.
Oh, I love that. Well, Ronit, this was such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for sharing and joining me in the podcast cafe. So what's next for you and where can the audience connect with you?
Okay, well, first, thank you so much for having me, Haley. I love talking with you, and I'm so excited about this podcast. I'm going to be sharing it with everyone. They need to listen, not just my episode, I mean your podcast.
Thank you.
What's next for me? Well, first of all, find me at Ronit Plank everywhere. I love Instagram. That's my favorite, pretty much. Subscribe to my newsletter. It's free. I have writing tips there and what's new on the podcast, etc. I am going to be teaching a class soon, so people can find links if they want to register for that. And I'm going to have new work getting published in the next couple months. They can always go to Substack or Instagram to find that. And just stay tuned because I have a lot more cooking and I'll have, season 6 starting in January 2025.
Awesome. Oh, well, this was so fun. I'll put all of your links in the show notes. And Ronit, you're one of my favorite people. And I'm excited for the audience to be able to hear you and hear how fun. And, you described your podcast as warm, but I think that's just because you are a warm person. And so I just love talking with you. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, I love right back at you, lady. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me in the Podcast Cafe. I hope you're leaving with fresh ideas and inspiration to take your podcast to the next level. Remember, podcasting is a journey and you don't have to do it alone. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Let's connect. Be sure you follow me on Instagram at Espresso Podcast Production or visit espressopodcastproduction.com for more tips, resources, and behind-the-scenes insights. I'd love to hear about your podcasting journey. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling extra generous, I'd love it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps more podcasters just like you find the show. Until next time, grab your coffee, keep creating, and I'll see you back here in the Podcast Cafe.